A new study is urging Ottawa to set aside money in the budget surplus to build affordable housing. It says homelessness is a major cost to the Canadian economy. According to researchers at York University, there are 35,000 Canadians who are homeless on any given night. They say this costs the economy about $7 billion a year in emergency shelters, in social services, in healthcare, and also in corrections costs. The study says the cost of building affordable housing would be about $1.7 billion a year, or $106 per Canadian. I want to talk more about some of the causes of homelessness, also some of the solutions. My next guest struggled with being homeless for nearly a decade while battling a drug addiction. He says the key to his recovery was a government-funded housing program. He has since spent many years researching homelessness. Eric Wiseman is a sociology professor at the College of New Caledonia in BC, and he joins me from our studio in St. John's. Professor, maybe they were dark days for you, but I wonder if you could take me back to those days when you did struggle with homelessness for 10 years. I'm wondering how you ended up there.
Well, you know, I think the key to remember is that there are so many different kinds of homelessness, and we tend to picture homelessness as these traditional avatars, you know, poor drunk men sleeping on benches, and that's not the issue that we're dealing with. My particular homelessness was of a kind we today call episodic homelessness. I was a really successful student, but I developed an addiction which largely incapacitated me and made me incapable of paying my bills, even though I could have. You know, I was completely devoted to my addiction. So I ended up on welfare, and then I ended up failing on my welfare obligations. And so there were times where I experienced what is a more common form of homelessness, where I was sleeping in other people's homes because I had nowhere to stay, crashing from time to time outdoors, and more or less just incapable of managing my life. I could have afforded to look after myself. I became incapable.
But if you were not willing to, though you say you could afford to pay certain bills, what would have said that you would have paid rent if there had been affordable housing?
It's interesting that you say that. Most addicts who become homeless, and homeless people I've worked with who define their homelessness as a result of their addiction, will tell you that they're not going to pay their rent if you give them a check. And in the work I did in Tent City in Toronto between 2000 and then as the residents of Tent City went through housing until 2008, a lot of them said that one of their problems was that their addictions got in the way of their willingness to pay rent.
Right.
But that's not the problem we're dealing with today. We're dealing today with people who work and can't afford to live.
So let's look at solutions then. How did affordable housing help you, and how could it help the thousands of others who need it?
Well, the key for me was it's not necessarily the housing. It's that the Ontario government at that time, this is in the mid-90s, gave me a chance to go to a long-term rehabilitation center where I learned how to live again, and where I had a lot of social and psychological supports that helped me not only gain control of my disease, but learn how to do chores and learn how to organize my life. And one of the things they taught me to do was to learn how to do nothing, like to learn how to be with myself without needing to medicate or act out. And so I was able to transition from my bottom through this housing experience, and they didn't let me out of that place till I was ready to take on a place to live. So supports, I think, are the key. And I think the key also is that you can't ask somebody to deal with addictions or mental health problems from the streets. And so the Housing First paradigm, which I've been working a lot with, is a very successful model. And the key to Housing First, where it works, is that Housing First has been really successful at giving people social supports as well.
So this is a missing piece of the puzzle when we use that word crisis to talk about homelessness?
It's a crisis because we're no longer talking about people who've made bad choices. We're talking about people who are still on the streets because we don't have enough long-term care facilities for some of the more severely damaged people in our populations.
Right.
And and that's a serious issue. And it's funny, a lot of the people who are being targeted for current housing programs are those particular cohorts that were deserted by governments in the mid-'80s and '90s with the retraction of services. So we're kind of filling that gap again. But the other, in my work, I've done research in tent cities and on the streets in a number of North American cities. And one of the things that surprises me the most is the number of people I meet who live in tents, in bushes, in downtown major cities, who go to work every day.
Right.
And that's the truth.
Is it more important then to have those stop gaps where you learn to do nothing, learn to be comfortable in your own skin without having to, as you say, act out? Or is it affordable housing, which, as you've said, if it was there, people wouldn't use the money, the check, to pay the rent? Well, how do you know, and you're going to tell me balance, right?
No, I'm going to tell you that if you look at the report that came out today, the most alarming figure for us as Canadians, and we can take this we can take the U.S. example as a proviso, and I'll say this to you in two parts.
Sure.
Because a lot of my research for my dissertation was done in American shanty towns. In the United States, they identify 47 million people as under the poverty line. And yet there's a figure of 146 million people who live in precarious housing, who have to choose between food, shelter, medicine, and education, and clothing each month. In Canada, the number's not as high, but the proportion is almost the same. So while we identify about 35,000 people who are using shelters, the number of people who are precariously housed, that means in jeopardy of becoming unhoused, is in the hundreds of thousands potentially. And that's a huge number for Canada. And so we need to make their living experience more affordable.
All right. So final question for you. In a nugget, what's the first step we should be doing?
Sorry, say that again?
What's the first thing we should be doing? If you could wrap it up for me and I can get my head around what is a huge problem.
We really need to figure a way to stop making rents and land values out of reach for people who live in the cities they live in. I mean, frankly, the gentrification of our city cores is making it, I can't afford to buy a house in Toronto. I don't think I could afford now to even buy a condo in Toronto, yet I'm a Torontonian. So I think we need to figure out how to make housing affordable for those who have a difficult time matching all of their monthly needs. I mean, housing is essential, correct?
Yes.
So after housing comes food. If you have to choose between the two, that's a pretty dangerous position to be in, and a lot of Canadians are in that position.
I want to thank you for your time, Professor, and I wish you the best in the days ahead.
I thank you very much for having me.
Professor Eric Wiseman with the College of New Caledonia. He was joining me from St. John's. Lots